I'm Indy Nidell, and this is Out of the Trenches, where I sit here in my chair of wisdom and answer all your questions about the First World War. Jan Vachtavik writes, "A truly great show you're making. I'm your fan since 1916. Wow, he's been our fan for 101 years. And I can't thank you enough for your great effort and even greater work, Indy and crew. I have a question for Out of the Trenches. On numerous occasions, Indy mentioned German anti-tank units trained exclusively for that purpose. Can you tell us about the training of those units and how exactly were they used in combat?" German anti-tank tactics were rather rudimentary in the Great War, and they mostly depended on organization, timing, and strong-mindedness of the soldiers. The tank was a fearsome opponent, since without any countermeasures, the defenders were pretty much helpless. So a lot of pressure was put on the soldiers who had to counter them. The early versions of the tanks, the Mark I's and the Schneiders, could still be penetrated by concentrated machine gun fire. So gunners were trained to aim at the weak spots, like the eyelets or certain welds or joints of the machines, which were discovered by German engineers after they examined the first wrecks on the battlefield. They used iron core bullets called the K-bullet, which would ricochet inside the tanks and take out the crew. The most effective countermeasure was, of course, artillery. Forward artillery observers were specially trained to look out for tank movements to coordinate defensive fire. Also, anti-tank squads were trained to drag artillery pieces, mostly light mountain guns or modified mine throwers, over muddy, uneven ground and wheel them into position. This was a very stressful and very dangerous job, and it took serious nerve to face a tank, which made only a small group of experienced soldiers able to do those jobs. The Germans tried using flamethrowers and the famous anti-tank rifle, but their effectiveness was nothing compared to the power of a hidden field gun. German engineers used measures that were more effective, like anti-tank ditches, mines, or even portable high explosive like the Gebalteladung, an improvised last-ditch means of fighting the tanks if all else failed. Tribesman says, having watched the excellent video of the Mark I tank at the Tank Museum, I have a question about the formations that were adapted by the soldiers. Did they still move forward in a wave after they went over the top? I could imagine that a lot of troops stayed close to the tank, using it as cover to cross no man's land. Well, staying close to a tank during an attack was both secure and dangerous at the same time. Sure, the infantry was safe against bullets behind the tank's armor, but tanks were also magnets for artillery fire. Another problem was the tank had no real way to communicate with the infantry around them, and it could move through flanking machine gun fire undamaged, leaving the vulnerable infantry bogged down behind. And if the tank was hit or was put out of action by mechanical failure or something, the group of soldiers behind them was stuck as well. So the most reasonable action was often to advance in concert, while the defenders often shifted their attention to the incoming tank as soon as it appeared on the battlefield. Attacking infantry could use the momentum and advance as far as possible. Then they waited for the tank to smash the barbed wire and follow in its wake, then dispersing into the trenches. The more tanks they used, and the more they were able to silence the German guns with their own artillery, the more this concept was able to succeed. Stephen McConaughey writes, hi Indy and crew again. Hi Steve. Again. My question is, what was Hermann Göring's involvement in the Great War? I am doing my social studies project on him, and I wanted to know his involvement. Hermann Göring was 21 when the war broke out, and he'd already reached second lieutenant in the Prussian cadet school in 1912. In the war, he was at first doing groundwork in a field reconnaissance unit in the 5th Army during the first battles in Alsace, until he got sick with rheumatoid arthritis, which made him unable to do infantry work. So he transferred to flight school, where he befriended Bruno Lürzer, who would later become a German flying ace. Together, they flew reconnaissance missions over the Western Front and directed German artillery fire in the Feldfliegerabteilung of the 5th Army. Apparently, Göring was an excellent observer, but headstrong and often charged with insubordination. In mid-1915, he left recon to be trained as a fighter pilot. He and Lürzer were eventually transferred to the Jasta 5. In mid-1917, he had scored 7 victories, becoming an ace, and was even promoted to Staffelführer of Jasta 27. Once, he was nearly killed when he tried to attack a bomber squadron mostly on his own, and only his capabilities as a pilot, sheer luck, and the skills of the surgeon on the operating table saved his life. Despite grave injuries, he climbed back into the cockpit and scored his 18th victory in April 1918. That earned him the Pour le Mérite. In June 1918, he was even given command of the famous flying circus, the Jagdgeschwader 1. This was very controversial, since he got the post over aces who had 40-plus victories. We still don't know for sure why he was considered, but it might have been for his influential connections. That's the short story, but you should look it up for yourselves. It's a very interesting story of a very talented fighter pilot. Eric Redbeard says, question for Out of the Trenches. I've been eyeing those caltrops on your desk for a long time now. Could you expound on those two in particular, and was there a specific front that these ancient traps were in particular heavy use? I'm thinking maybe areas where cavalry were a concern, but those fronts seem too large and dynamic to make caltrops practical. I know you've covered traps to some extent, but I don't recall anything about these. Playing Verdun makes me realize how horrible it would be to dive into a shell hole only to land on a large caltrop, maybe with residual chemicals or a poison on it. Well, the use of caltrops to fend off cavalry is as old as warfare in ancient times. Often it was just two pieces of metal welded together so that one spike faces up. It would pierce hooves and boots alike and cause crippling injuries. And yes, infection was one of the biggest killers in the war. A simple cut from a piece of polluted metal was enough to kill a soldier. Caltrops' biggest advantage was that they were cheap and easy to produce and required no training, so anyone could just throw them on the ground. They were portable, they could be retrieved from the battlefield and used again. The rumor alone that an area might have been compromised with caltrops could lead to a reconsideration of an advance by the officers. But true, to completely block off an area, you would need a lot of them and men and time to spread them accordingly. Simply laying barbed wire across the ground was usually easier and faster to do, and it'd do the same job. That's why caltrops weren't used that much later in the war. If you'd like to see our bio special about another very talented fighter pilot, you can click right here for our special on Georges Guynemer. Do not forget to subscribe, of course, and like us on Facebook, and follow us around the streets when you see us. It's not creepy at all. See you next time.